Every day, the news brings more and more images of random violence, torture, and sexual aggression right into our living rooms. Violence and violent images permeate more and more aspects of our lives. And I think it's time to draw the line.
Thanks, Joe. I'm Ronnie Ersenbach, and this is the Band Media Podcast, where we will be talking about the art that crossed that line. Anarchists and commies and queer folk, oh my. This week, we're popping on the big kid pants and hopping into the history early so we can take a look at the organization behind my favorite docuseries, The X-Files. That's right, Agents Dana Scully and Fox Mulder's on-again, off-again governmental daddy, the FBI, or the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Fun fact, in the opening credits of The X-Files, we see both Scully and Mulder's badges. Actual FBI badges read, quote, Federal Bureau of Investigation, United States Department of Justice, end quote. But creating a fake FBI badge, even for the purposes of being a prop on a television program, is in fact very illegal. The FBI is a very serious organization. So the opening credits for the show switched the words justice and investigation to read, quote, Federal Bureau of Justice, Department of Investigation. The FBI, again, a very serious organization, traces its roots back to 1896 with the National Bureau of Crime Identification, or NBCI for short. The NBCI had a pretty simple purpose: to record identifying information on criminals and share that information with law enforcement. A kind of national database for cops to use before computers or the internet were available. It would be in 1901 that President William McKinley would be assassinated by an anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz, turning Vice President Theodore Roosevelt into President Theodore Roosevelt. This gave Roosevelt what is historically referred to as a big old boner against anarchism and anarchists, going so far as to say, quote, anarchy is a crime against the whole human race, and all mankind should band against the anarchist, end quote, in his first message to Congress after becoming president. Teddy would tap Attorney General Charles Bonaparte, grandnephew of Napoleon, but no relation to Max Bonaparte, an adult film star that I made up for this joke, to find and keep an eye on as many anarchists as he could. At first, Bonaparte would farm this work out as he had no agents of his own. Mostly to the Secret Service, but also occasionally other agencies or private investigators. But in 1908, the Secret Service's government daddy agency, the Department of Treasury, was forbade by Congress to let the Justice Department use any of its employees. So, Bonaparte hired 25 new agents of his own and poached 9 Secret Service agents to create a new agency called the Bureau of Investigation that would answer directly to the Department of Justice. It would also absorb the NBCI. Now, all of this is well and fine, but when talking about the FBI, there's one man that must be mentioned. The man who arguably led the Bureau through its coming of age and formed it into the organization we all know and love today. That man is J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover made his first big splash at the then still just BI, or BOI, in 1919, when he was tapped by the Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer to carry out the aptly titled Palmer Raids. The Palmer Raids, on paper, were an attempt to capture radical socialists, anarchists, and communists and deport them from the country. What it actually was a giant clusterfuck resulting in the arrests of 10,000 people, most of which were Italian immigrants and Eastern European Jewish immigrants with alleged leftist ties, with particular focus on Italian anarchists and immigrant leftist labor activists. Only 556 of those folks were actually deported, but over 2,000 of the warrants were canceled as being illegal. This large-scale violation of civil rights by, may I remind you again, a very serious organization, actually resulted in the ACLU being founded as a response. Politically, it was the beginning of the end for Palmer, but Hoover was moving on up. J. Edgar Hoover officially took over as the head of the BI on May 10th, 1924. The Bureau had grown to include around 650 employees, including 441 special agents, 3 of which were actually women. This is no small feat considering women had only been legally allowed to vote for 4 years at that point. Hoover made all 3 of them resign and put a ban on women's special agents, a ban that would last until his death in 1972. Hoover would oversee rebranding the BI to the FBI in 1935. During his reign as head of the FBI, Hoover could be described as tough on crime, or tactically aggressive, or light on human rights. While he was successful in bringing in several gangster-era public enemies like John Dillinger, Al Capone, and Pretty Boy Floyd, the Bureau was also infamous for things like spreading domestic surveillance, keeping extensive dossiers on public figures, being antagonistic to the civil rights movement, and dousing fuel on the fire that was the anti-communist Red Scare of the 1950s. After Truman issued his Executive Order 9835, better known as the Loyalty Order, in 1947, which set up loyalty review boards to root out commies, it would be the FBI that did the research, which, fun fact, resulted in 6.6 million people being investigated and absolutely 0 cases of espionage were uncovered. Now, fortunately, this order and its review boards were revoked in 1947 by Eisenhower's new and improved Executive Order 10450. Unfortunately, it did that by taking away power from the review boards and giving it to the federal agencies, as in the F in FBI. It also expanded its search to weed out those engaged in quote-unquote sexual perversion. Luckily for the FBI, they had a program called the quote sex deviates in quote program that had already been in place since May 10th, 1950. This, however, was very, very bad news for folks in the queer community, as this took the commonly referred to lavender scare up to 11. So I ask you this, dear listener, friends, if I may be so bold, what could it be about the song Louie Louie? You know, that oldie song that your boomer dad or grandpa mumbles along with every time it comes on the radio. The one that goes dun 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 dun. What did that song do to end up in the crosshairs of the very, very serious Federal Bureau of Investigation's crosshairs? Well, in order to answer that, let's take it back to 10 a.m. on April 6th, 1963, when a group of scrappy young rock and rollers that went by the name the Kingsmen were entering the recording studio Northwest Recorders to do their very second recording. The session was put together by the band's manager, a man by the name of Ken Chase. Ken Chase was no stranger to music. In fact, he was the program director for the radio station KISN, or Kissin' if you're naughty. He had decided to take his years of learning how to choose music and see if he could call an act before it got popular. In his effort to do this, he opened up a nightclub called The Chase in Milwaukee, Oregon. Well, strictly speaking, he opened up a teen club, which is like a nightclub, except instead of booze, it served soda and mocktails. Ken Chase had made the Kingsmen the official house band of The Chase around about 1961. Eventually, it became clear that the band had something with the song Louie Louie. It would pack the dance floor every time they played it. They even did a set one night that was 90 minutes long, where they did nothing but play a 90-minute long version of Louie Louie. That's right, 1.5 hours of that infectious dun 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 dun, and the people loved it. So it was a no-brainer that this would be the song that they committed to wax when they made this demo in a 1-hour recording session. Although, admittedly, this was no high-end recording. The studio only had 3 mics, and the vocal mic was on a boom stand, which reaches high into the air, and it was so hard to handle that the mic ended up being placed above lead singer Jack Eli's head. In fact, he had to stand on his tippy toes and scream his vocals to get them recorded. Add to that, he also had braces at the time. The engineer gave the go-ahead, and the band started playing. About halfway through their first take, Ken Chase cut them off and told them to hold tight while they made some adjustments in the booth. Then he gave them the go-ahead, and they laid down their first official full take. There was an undeniable energy, but the track was far from perfect. Some of the more obvious errors were when drummer Lynn Easton accidentally banged his sticks together and never fully recovered the beat, and singer Jack Eli came in early on a verse, abruptly stopped, and then started up again on his actual cue. After they finished that take, they readied to do their second take. But band manager Ken Chase told them there would be no second take. But he did assure them, quote, "It was great, man. You never did the song better," end quote. And then added, quote, "Now what are you going to do for the B-side?" End quote. Now, maybe Chase's years of experience made him know deep in his heart that the imperfect recording, in its rawness and in its energy, would be exactly the mixture that would take the Pacific Northwest and then America by storm. That those strained, jarbled, unintelligible lyrics would lead to a defining rock and roll sound. One that Seattle would echo generations later in the grunge movement. Maybe, just maybe, Ken Chase was the sort of visionary whose ears could listen through space and time itself and hear something right in front of us that any of the rest of us would have missed. Or it could be that he only paid for an hour and he wanted to get as many songs in as he could, and figured it wasn't really that important because the demo's main purpose was to get them a gig on a cruise ship anyway. I will let you be the judge, but either way, that is the story of the recording of this very messy classic with completely unintelligible lyrics. It also should be noted they did not get the cruise ship gig. Wah wah. However, the single did make its way across the desk of one Arnie Ginsberg, or Woo Woo to his listeners. Ginsberg was one of the DJs that still picked his own music. An almost completely extinct practice here in the year of our Lord 2023. But even in 1963, this was becoming more of a rarity. The practice of payola, which is record companies paying DJs to play their band's songs, had been common for decades. But as the 50s came to an end, partially spurred on by older, more established record labels, tired of seeing songs from newfangled indie labels pop up on the airwaves, and also America discovering a TV game show by the name of 21 was completely rigged, more pressure was coming on the government to do something about this practice. The resulting congressional investigations in 1960 shook the industry. In order to avoid accusations and later heavy fines, most DJs across the country were stripped of their authority to choose music by their stations. Amazingly, our man Woo Woo, who was one of the ones who testified before Congress that he was guilty of this very practice, not only kept his job, but as mentioned before, still got to pick his own music. It was because of this that the distributor brought him the single, Sans Bribe, along with a handful of others. Woo Woo's first thought after hearing the lowly 45 start up was, quote, "Wow, this is interesting, but it sounds awful," end quote. Not the highest praise, but its weird mix of interesting and awful did earn it a spot on Woo Woo's airwaves in a segment he called the worst record of the week. And this was more of a novelty than anything else, but to his credit, he did realize that it was interesting enough to play twice. The next morning, he came into the station to the news that round about 50 folks had called in to see where they could get the Louie Louie album, which was an extraordinary outcome off of just 2 plays. WMEX, the station on which Woo Woo DJ'd, was a Boston radio station. This meant that the Kingsmen's audition tape for a cruise gig was now starting to run rampant through the Northeast, the most heavily populated and influential market in America at the time. The song would be picked up by the distributor Wand, who released the recording under their label. The track would eventually go on to peak at number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and sold 1 million copies by April 1964. It was a bona fide hit. Now, I do try my best not to be cynical, so I want to acknowledge that despite, or maybe even because of, the song's minimalist recording, it is a legit banger. The garage rock classic with an absolutely infectious rhythm and vocal melody that just begs you to mumble along. Now, all that being said, an undeniable portion of the reason that this song spread like wildflower is that within a year or so of its release, it became common knowledge across every middle school and high school campus that this song was in fact incredibly filthy. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "If you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you." Well, so too can it be said that when teenagers gaze into anything, a good lot of them will see sex gazing right back. And that was exactly the case for this song, despite the fact that the lyrics were clean as the proverbial whistle. But as this urban legend got on the radar of adults, you know, the supposedly calm and rational ones, it was then when the shit really hit the fan. Radio stations around America began to ban the album at the behest of so-called concerned parents. Many locations across the U.S. even tried to put a ban on the song, including the entire state of Indiana, a ban requested by Governor Matthew Welsh. But these concerned parents did not stop at lowly state governors with their very concerning concerns. This was a very serious problem that required the solutions of a very serious man with the backing of a very serious organization behind him. That's right, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold. That rant from the beginning is in fact about to pay off. Enter J. Edgar Hoover and his Federal Bureau of Investigation. Citizens from around the country could write directly into Mr. Hoover, like some kind of fan mail for bootlickers. One of these letters from a quote-unquote concerned citizen sometime in June of 1965 started out by saying, quote, as a member of Redacted, dedicated in the fight against pornography, end quote. Fight against pornography. Well, now this is personal. They would go on to say, quote, we became aware of the dual set of lyrics that, without a doubt, someone had masterminded an auditory illusion, end quote. And, quote, we realize the damage is done and that the Louie Louie purveyors are getting away with setting a new precedence. That along with the movies, the magazines, the paperbacks, our kids will now be hit with a fourth front. Records, end quote. Oh, just wait until this person finds out about video games and TikTok. J. Edgar would write back a week later, basically telling them that he understands their concern and that the FBI is always putting forth effort, but, quote, with reference to the record you described, I am unable to make comment on any current investigations being conducted by the FBI, end quote. Although, as part of a note he made concerning this very letter, he did confirm, quote, the record Louie Louie is subject of investigation under character of interstate transport of obscene matter, end quote. That's right, the FBI, and I don't feel like I need to remind you at this point, a very, very serious organization, held a 31-month investigation into made-up dirty lyrics in hopes to bust it under the Interstate Transportation of Obscene Matter, or ITOM, which I will be calling it for the remainder of the episode. ITOM was considered such a grievous, heinous, highly punishable offense that when the agents working on the investigation had to ship the record to other offices, they did so with the use of a shield that the annals of history only remembers as being called, quote, obscene cover, end quote, which ironically sounds like they Mod Podged cutouts from old porno mags all over it. It should be noted that I am in no way endorsed or being paid by Mod Podge, but Mod Podge, if you're listening, the FBI were so scared of the supposed obscene material that they ended up destroying some of the copies of the record, partially so they didn't run afoul of ITOM themselves, but also because of porno cooties, I guess. Now, how vile were these supposed lyrics that they warranted all of this, forgive my French, hullabaloo? Well, like any good tall tale or urban legend, the details vary from place to place or person to person. But the following is one example of the obscene lyrics. And in this, you'll get a ballpark idea of what most of the versions contained. Here we go. The chorus was, oh, Louie Louie, oh, no, get her way down low. Oh, Louie Louie, oh, baby, get her down low. And then here comes the first verse. A fine little girl a-waitin' for me. She's just a girl across the way. Well, I'll take her and park all alone. She's never a girl I'd lay at home. Chorus repeats. Second verse. At night at 10, I lay her again. Fuck you, girl. Oh, all the way. Oh, my bed, and I lay her there. I feel my bone in her hair. The chorus repeats again. Third verse. Okay, let's give it to them right now. She got a rag on, I'll move above. It won't be long, she'll slip it off. I'll take her in my arms again. I'll tell her I'll never leave again. Repeat the chorus. Get that broad out of here. Well, gee, I hope your kids weren't around to hear that. During the course of the FBI's investigation, they listened to Louie Louie at multiple speeds, did multiple interviews, and at the end of it, simply came up with, we can't understand if the guy is saying bad words or not. And thus the FBI moved on to other, hopefully at least equally as important FBI business. How did Jack Eli and the Kingsmen feel about this? Well, to make a long story short, they had already gone their separate ways before this fiasco really got going. In fact, the FBI never even interviewed Jack Eli. They might not have even known he exists, as the band had a new singer by that time. You know who else they didn't bother to interview? Richard Berry. You know, the guy who wrote the fucking song? That's right. Not only is the Kingsmen version a cover, it wasn't even the first cover. In fact, the whole time the Kingsmen were climbing the charts with their version, another version by Paul Revere and the Raiders was following close behind them for a bit, but it never quite took the lead. Paul Revere and the Raiders, you may remember from the incredibly poorly aged song Indian Reservation. The song had managed to become a favorite of live dance halls in the Pacific Northwest, especially around Washington. Hometown heroes, the Fabulous Wailers, were the first to have popularized the song in the area somewhere around the late 50s. Also, one of the first, besides Richard Berry, of course, to put the song down on wax in 1961. But even before then, the song had managed to find its way on the set list of a handful of local bands after Dave Lewis and Ron Holden, a couple of local R&B musicians, had played it at a battle of the bands. They had heard it on a local radio station that was promoting a show Richard Berry was playing at in the Seattle area in September of 1957. Richard Berry was born in Louisiana, but him and his family moved to Los Angeles when he was just a baby. He began performing in doo-wop bands at a very early age. He recorded with a large number of them, including the Penguins, the Cadets and the Chimes, the Crowns, the Five Hearts, the Hunters, the Rams, the Whips, and the Dreamers. But it was with the Flares he would have his first taste of success recording She Wants to Rock on Modern Records. He was also tapped to do a deep voice for the Robins' Riot in Cell Block 9, and also was on Etta James's first big hit, The Wallflower, Dance With Me Henry, playing the voice of Henry. By the end of 1954, Berry had left the Flares to form his own band, the Pharaohs. No relation to Sam the Sham and the Pharaohs of Little Red Riding Hood and Wooly Bully fame, another song whose lyrics were completely ununderstandable. It was in 1955 that he would pen Louie Louie while he was with the Pharaohs. It was a calypso-inspired ode of a pidgin-speaking Jamaican sailor trying to find his one-time lover, Louie being the bartender. No doubt that on top of the less-than-ideal recording setup, a white boy from the Pacific Northwest yelping out Jamaican pidgin, or patois, may have been one of the main contributing factors of how a line like, "On that ship, I dream she there, I smell the rose in her hair," got interpreted as, "And on that chair I'll lay her there, I felt my bone in her hair." Berry had a minor regional hit with the track, selling about 130,000 copies, mostly around the greater Los Angeles area, but also all the way up and down the coast. Sadly, he saw very little of that money. His label refused to pay him royalties, citing the fact that he had done some outside recording, and that was in violation of his contract. The steam from the hit kept him working as a traveling live act for a bit, including up to Seattle, where he got played on the radio. But with no new hits, the money started getting tight, and he had to take a day job. But even then, with a hip injury he had had since he was young, it didn't do much to elevate his situation. So in 1959, only 4 short years before the Kingsmen would make Louie Louie a nationwide hit, Richard Berry sold his publishing and songwriting rights to Limax Music for a measly $750 so he can fund his upcoming wedding. And so it would be for the next 28 years. Berry would only see a small semi-annual BMI check for his recording, and they would be years that were hard on Berry. A divorce from the woman who he took out the money to marry in the first place, ending up on welfare and living with his mother. Berry would say later, quote, "I was flattered it became a hit, but then I got bitter about it. Here I was, the writer, but all those millions went into someone else's pockets," end quote. It was in 1983 that a man by the name of Chuck Rubin reached out to Berry through an old friend. He was with an agency called Artist Rights and told Berry he thought he could get him his rights back. What followed was a very slow and painful litigation that, in all honesty, did little to help the situation for the first 2 years. Then, in 1983, they caught their first big break. And that break was wine coolers. Okay, let me explain. A wine cooler company called California Cooler was looking to pay out big bucks to use Louie Louie in their commercial. Now faced not only with Berry and Rubin's case against them, but also the possibility of losing out on the spot to Wild Thing because their song was tied up in litigation, Limax folded. Going forward, Berry would get 75% of his song, half of the publishing rights, and all of the songwriting rights. From that day forward, Richard Berry would get paid, and get paid well. Sadly, Berry would die only a little more than 10 years later of heart failure in 1997. But he did so a millionaire. Admittedly far from ideal, but better late than never. And that, dear listeners, friends, if I may be so bold, is just some of the very sordid history of the song Louie Louie. If you want to know more, the definitive work on the song is the very long titled book, Louie Louie, The History and Mythology of the World's Most Famous Rock and Roll Song, including the full details of its torture and persecution at the hands of the Kingsmen, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, and a cast of millions, and introducing, for the first time anywhere, the actual dirty lyrics by Dave Marsh. The link will be in the show notes. Although there is one last fun fact I want to leave you with. Fun fact, for all the investigating that the very serious FBI did looking for obscenity, they missed one thing right in front of their faces the whole time. Remember how I told you one of the many mistakes that was made on the recording was when the drummer accidentally cracked his drumsticks together? Well, not only did that mess up his beat, but he yelled out "fuck" in frustration. And if you listen for it, at about the 1 minute and 46 second mark, you can hear him yell it plain as day. I bet you thought I was going to say the other thing. Okay, one final fun fact. I'll miss you, friends. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Band Media Podcast. Oh, there goes that music again. We got a Patreon now, so if you want to directly support the show, please go check it out over at patreon.com/bandmediapodcast. Also, feel free to find us on all the socials, but TikTok is where I'm most active, at BandRonnie. Please like, comment, and share, but if you really want to help the podcast out, tell your friends about us. That way, we can all be friends. Well, that's enough of my rambling for now, but keep being wonderful, dear listeners. Adios.